Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Solferino, the birth of an idea, or Solferino, the birth of an ideal. 6 months ago, France and Italy commemorated the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Solferino. As you know, this battle took place on 24 June 1859 in northern Italy. It was the decisive battle in the war for the independence and unity of Italy, but also the bloodiest battle Europe had witnessed since Waterloo. 10 hours of fighting resulted in 6,000 dead, more than 30,000 wounded. The medical services of the French army, which remained master of the field of battle, were totally overwhelmed. In fact, we can say they were absent from the scene because the medical corps was part of the supply corps, and the officers in charge, since the army was moving fast, took the vehicles of the medical services in order to carry the ammunition, which means when the battle took place, most medical personnel were just far behind, out of action, unable to do anything. In fact, according to official records, the French army had 10 doctors on the spot, 10 doctors for 30,000 wounded. With the help of comrades, with the help of the local peasants, the wounded were transported to the nearest city, Castiglione delle Stiviere, nearest city, where after 2 days you counted 9,000 wounded for a population of less than 5,000 inhabitants. So 2 men lying for 1 able-bodied person. 500 of them were assembled in the main church of the city, the Chiesa Maggiore. Now you may close your eyes and try to imagine the scene. 500 men, many of them dying, suffering the blood, the smell, the cries. And there, to this same city of Castiglione arrived, probably on the same fateful day of 24 June 1859, a young Swiss businessman, actually from the city of Geneva, his name Henry Dunant. He was not a medical doctor, but of course he could not shut his heart to the suffering he was witnesses. What did he do? Well, what every one of you would have done in similar circumstances. He forgot about his business trip. He tried to give whatever assistance he could. So he gave water to men who were suffering from thirst, washed wounds, replaced bandages, sent his coachman to the next city, Brescia, to buy food, sheets, cloth, and so on. And after 2 weeks, totally exhausted, he returned to Geneva on the very day where the emperors of France and Austria met in Villafranca and in 2 hours agreed on the general conditions of peace and put an end to this bloody war. And then Dunant returned to his own affairs in Algeria. However, he could not forget about the wounded of Solferino. And after 2 years, he decided to return to his native city in Geneva. He studied the campaign, and he wrote a small book where he consigned his own testimony. The book actually is in 2 parts. The first part is a description of the battle, really typical in style of the military history of the time. But suddenly, it's the hidden face of war, which is laid bare. It's the abandonment of the wounded, the suffering, the blood, the smell, and all the abandonment of those wounded. And he concluded with 2 questions, which are also 2 proposals. Would it not be desirable, I quote, in time of peace and quiet, to form relief societies for the purpose of having care given to the wounded in wartime by zealous, devoted, and thoroughly qualified volunteers? So the idea, relief societies, volunteers, and this is the starting point of the Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies, which exist all over the world. But for these volunteers to be able to carry their mission of mercy, of course, they needed to be recognized and respected. Hence, the second idea, the idea of a treaty protecting those volunteers on the field of battle. Would it not be desirable to formulate some international principle sanctioned by a convention, inviolate in character, which once agreed upon and ratified might constitute the basis for societies for the relief of the wounded in the different European countries, and this is the starting point of modern international humanitarian law. The book was published in October 1862, 1,600 copies, and on the cover was written, "Not to be sold." So what is the purpose of a book if it's not to be sold? It was a kind of open letter which Dunant sent to notabilities, sovereigns, ministers, generals, well-known doctors, writers, philanthropists, in order to promote his idea. It was immediately successful. 2 further editions were printed in the coming month, and the book was translated in various languages: English, Dutch, German, Swedish, Russian, Italian, and Spanish. However, what counted was not just the number of readers, but the level of the readership. And Dunant received messages of support from a lot of persons in various countries. I would say a little bit like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published 10 years earlier. It's a book that steered its time and left an imprint on history. Enthusiasm, however, will not lead very far unless it is supported by a strategy, unless there are the means to translate the idea into concrete realization. And at this point, one has to mention a fellow citizen of Dunant who stepped in, a young man also, almost the same age, a lawyer, Gustave Moignet. He was the president of a local charity, so a local charitable society, the Geneva Public Welfare Society. And having read Dunant's book, he decided to take these proposals to the society. You believe the society would be very enthusiastic. In fact, not. While everybody recognized the generosity of the proposals, they just consider that what can our small society here in Geneva do with all that? The minutes of the debate concluded it's not up to our society to take care of that. However, Moignet was very pragmatic, and since a Congress of welfare societies was to take place in Berlin that year, in September 1863, he proposed that the society should just write a report to develop Dunant's proposal and submit it to this Congress. And this the society accepted because there was no risk in it. And they set up a small drafting committee in order to prepare this report. A committee of 5 members, of course Dunant, Moignet himself, 2 medical doctors, Dr. Appia and Dr. Maunoir, and one very respected figure, General Dufour, certainly the most respected figure in Geneva. You know him because you have seen his statue on horseback in front of the opera here in Geneva. They met a few days later and immediately decided to constitute themselves as a permanent relief committee for the wounded, which means they overstepped the mandate which had been given to them, which was just to write a report. Why? For this, one has to understand their project. They had a very ambitious project. They had no doubt that the governments would not devote to the medical services of the armed forces the resources that would be needed for these medical services to be able to cope with the consequences of any major battle. No state would afford the money. Therefore, private societies were necessary, and those societies would call on the resources from the public. This was the first element. They would recruit and train volunteers with those resources. They would take contact with the respective government to make sure that these services would be accepted in case of war, which means some form of cooperation with the military authorities, and so that the charitable mission of the volunteers be recognized and accepted. They should carry the same flag everywhere. This is the origin of the Red Cross flag, and a treaty should be concluded in order to protect these volunteers and also protect the medical services of the armed forces on the field of battle, because this was one reason why wounded were left unattended, that the medical personnel at the time was not protected, which means they could not venture on the field of battle or they ran the risk of being fired at. However, in August, they were informed that the Berlin Congress would not take place, which means their strategy was in shambles. But they did not hesitate long. They decided to organize their own Congress in Geneva. In fact, they organized two conferences. The first one took place in October 1863. It brought together government representatives and representatives from various charitable societies in different European countries, adopted 10 resolutions which form the basis of the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies which exist today. However, such a conference with a mixed participation, government representative and private person, of course, was not qualified to adopt a treaty. For a conference to be so qualified, it had to be a diplomatic conference, it had to be convened by a government. And therefore, they turned towards the Swiss government and asked Switzerland to take the initiative of summoning a diplomatic conference. This diplomatic conference took place in Geneva in August 1864, actually in the Geneva Town Hall, in the room which is now called, since many of you are US citizens, the Alabama Room, because that's where the famous Alabama arbitration took place a few years later. But it could as well be called the room of the Geneva Convention, because that's where the Geneva Convention was signed on 22nd August 1864. I will quote only two provisions from that convention. The main article, Article 1, ambulances and military hospitals shall be recognized as neutral and as such protected and respected by the belligerents. So the principle of the neutrality of medical services on the field of battle. And secondly, wounded or sick combatants, to whatever nation they may belong, shall be collected and cared for. This is the basis of the principle of impartiality and the ethical foundation of humanitarian action till today. So it's really the origin of contemporary international humanitarian law. All later conventions, the Hague Convention, the Geneva 1949 Geneva Conventions now in force, derive really from this original treaty adopted on 22nd August 1864. So barely 5 years elapsed between the Battle of Solferino and the adoption of the Geneva Convention, which was really the achievement of Dunant's idea. And I would say only 2 years, less than 2 years, between the publication of Dunant's book, A Memory of Solferino, and the realization of his ideas. So if we now turn to your particular concern, the birth of a great ideas, what were the key factors? I will mention 7. First, one man. Without any specific position, no official position, so really at the beginning, private initiative. One man confronted with exceptional circumstances, in this case, the dreadful consequences of a big battle. Third, one man able to translate the shock he suffered from what he witnessed at Solferino into a book and into concrete proposals. Fourth, the importance of a strategy and of an ambitious but coherent plan of action. And here the key role is certainly Gustave Moignet, also a private person without any official mandate. Fifth, mobilization, progressively enlarging the circle of persons concerned by the proposal and ready to support it. Sixth, the use of the leverage of public opinion to put pressure on governments and on the bureaucracies that, of course, as every bureaucracy, resisted new proposals, new ideas, no civilians on the field of battle, and so on and so forth. And seventh, on the part of Dunant and the other members of the Geneva Committee, today International Committee of the Red Cross, because this 5-member committee created by the Geneva Public Welfare Society continued and still exists today, is the International Committee of the Red Cross. On the part of Dunant and his colleagues, an absolute faith in their proposal. They were convinced that they were right. They were convinced that it was both feasible and realistic. They had no doubt that it had to be done. Lo que cambia el mundo es la fe y no la fuerza. What changes the world is faith and not force, wrote the Catalan poet and historian José Pujol. Well, we know it's not always the case, unfortunately, but sometimes it is. Thank you.